Okay, good evening, Professor Paul Kennedy. I am actually a retired Royal Navy Captain Chung. I will be moderating today's session. And also I currently working as Director of Center for Maritime Security in KIMS, Korea Institute for Maritime Strategy. I think at this moment is very special because we all have very prominent scholar like you with Royal Naval Cadet. So before I begin, let me first take a moment to introduce you to the Royal Naval Cadet on board the two ships. Paul Kennedy is the Richardson Dilworth, Professor of History, Director of International Security Studies at Yale University, and the Distinguished Fellow of the Brady-Johnson Program in Grand Strategy. As you all know, he is internationally known for his writings and commentaries on global political, economic, and strategic issues. His best-known work is The Rise and the Fall of the Great Powers, which provoked an intense debate on its publication in 1988 and has been translated into more than 20 languages, including Korean. He is also the author or editor of 19 books, including The Rise of Anglo-German Antagonism, The Wavelengths of the Great Powers, and the Realities Behind Diplomacy, and Preparing for the 21st Century. He obtained his BA at Newcastle University and his PhD at the University of Oxford. He is a former fellow of the Institute for Advanced Studies, Princeton University, and of the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung in Bonn. He holds many honorary degrees and is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and the American Philosophical Society and the American Academy of Art and Sciences. He was made commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2000 for services to history and elected a fellow of British Academy in June 2003. In the interest of time, it would be better to stop introducing him right now, even though there are still more that needs to be done. But before going further, there are some notice I want to share with all of our naval cadets on board. First, we are going to have about 30-minute Q&A session right after the end of his lecture. The session will be open to the all of audiences of naval cadets. So do not hesitate to raise any questions or to make any comment to the Professor Paul Kennedy. And if we do that, you're more than welcome. And also, as you know, there are the foldable microphones available to any cadet who want to make or raise questions or the opinions. Before you raise your questions, please raise your hand and identify yourself with your name so that I can direct you to the professor. Now, without further ado, let me turn this floor over to Professor Paul Kennedy, please.
Thank you so much, Captain Chung. Good evening. It is a great honor for me to be addressing you, the cadets of Korean Navy, in your journey around this long period of time on the sea. And in that time, as you are thinking of this topic of navies and of sea power and of what the national purpose of your country's navy is today and what navies are and how important navies are, both past and present and in the future. So that will be indeed the topic of my 30 minutes of remark. Sea power today, but before then in the past, and then thinking a little about into the future. I will conclude with some remarks about the situation in the Pacific Ocean and in East Asia with regard to international affairs and sea power, and hope to be able to receive questions you may throw at me at the end of my remarks. For many thousands of years, of course, primitive human beings and societies traveled across the sea, so you could talk about there being sea power in the Indian Ocean or sea power in the Baltic Sea. And certain established countries many 2,000 years ago, such as ancient Greece or the Roman Empire, did indeed have significant navies and therefore did show themselves up to have sea power. But all of their sea powers, I would argue to you, were limited in scope geographically. When what we call modern sea power occurs, it takes place from approximately the year 1500 in the Western way of counting chronology, when they began coming out of the smaller nation states of Western Europe, such as Portugal and Spain, a series of exploration voyages increasingly carried out by more and more powerful sailing ships and gun sailing ships, which then were under the control or under the flag of the monarch of a particular European power, the Royal Portuguese Navy, the Royal Spanish Navy, later on a little bit more France, the Dutch Republic, and also more famously, the Royal Navy of Great Britain. What were the constituent parts of the sea powers of these royal navies, or in the Dutch case, Republican Navy? They were organized well under an admiralty. They had training for their young cadets and their junior officers, just as you are being trained. They had a shipbuilding industry behind them, which was developing ever more newer technologies and especially ever greater firepower. These royal navies of the European states went out across the oceans, down across the North Atlantic to begin to establish along the eastern seaboard of the United States and to set up the beginnings of North American colonies. They also turned out to be exploring, going around the Cape Town of South Africa and across the Indian Ocean. The first of these exploration voyages, led by the Portuguese Royal Navy, was soon coming into the South China Seas, and then coming up also to Japan, and a little later on to the Korean Peninsula. These rivaling European powers also fought among and between themselves at sea. They battled in war after war after war through the 16th century, through into the 17th and the 18th and the 19th centuries. Over time, the most powerful of those navies emerged as the Royal Navy of Great Britain, the island state, way on the far side of the ocean from Korean Peninsula. And it was only able, however, to achieve that prominence after a succession of very, very intense naval conflicts against the navies of France in particular, but also the navies of France and Spain. As it was fighting the navies of France and Spain, the Royal Navy would acquire distant naval bases in many parts of the globe, in the Caribbean of the West Indies, in the Mediterranean itself, such as famous naval harbors like Gibraltar and Malta, in the Indian Ocean, because it was then soon to begin to establish colonial and naval bases in Sri Lanka, later on at the beginning of the 19th century in Singapore. By the 19th century, it was also moving into Australia and New Zealand itself. How was the historian, how was the political leader to understand what the sea power was doing and what constituted sea power? The best way in which sea power was described and analyzed occurred in a book which is familiar to all of you because it is translated into many languages, including, of course, Korean language, namely the book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. It was written by an American naval captain who was also a teacher at and a professor at the Naval War College, the United States Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. In this treatise on sea power, Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, because that was the way we pronounce his name, Mahan, Captain Mahan began by looking at the constituent parts, the qualities, as he put it, of sea power before he began a long historical story of Western sea power and the struggles of the Western nations in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Captain Mahan suggested that there were about 5 or 6 constituent parts of all sea powers, past and present, and for the audience to assume also into the future. Geography played a great role because sea power could obviously not be acquired by a country which had no sea. It had no waters around it. You could not talk, for example, about Mongolian sea power or about Swiss or Austrian sea power because they were not in any way attached to the sea. The size of a country and the size of a population also counted. The location of where the nation was in the geography of a globe was very important. An island nation such as Great Britain, that is to say England, Ireland, Scotland, had very advantageous geographical position. So also does, say, Japan. So also does the United States of America, because it has a sea coastline on its western Pacific shore and on its eastern shore in the Atlantic, and also in the Caribbean. The size and nature and advancement of its industry and the technology was also significant. A naval culture of the country concerned was very important indeed. This surely is what your instructors are trying to suggest to you in your education as future naval officers. All of this together constituted the parts of sea power. For those many 300 or so years, indeed, as I've said, from about the 1700s to about the year 1900 or about 1950, the dominant sea power was that of Great Britain. During the 20th century, however, there occurred 2 very, very large naval contestations, which we associate also with the First World War and the Second World War. It was during the First World War that the United States Navy began to develop from being one of the 2 or 3 navies to being a significant battle fleet and naval force by 1919. The United States Navy, along with the Japanese Navy and the British Navy, signed in international numerical control agreements at Washington, a set of understandings about the relative size of their sea power. Even at the beginning of the Second World War at sea, which first of all takes place in Europe, in the Atlantic and in the Mediterranean, but after the attack upon Pearl Harbor in 1941, sea power also begins to develop in fighting terms in the Pacific. In the course of those many battles at sea, steadily and after the year 1943, a new #1 dominant naval power, a new sea power, rises to the fore. And that is, of course, the United States Navy itself. The navies of Nazi Germany, of Italy, of France are all destroyed in the fighting over around European waters. The Navy of Japan will slowly be destroyed by the great battles at sea in the Pacific Ocean. The Royal Navy will fight very well and will remain the 2nd largest navy in world terms, but it also will find itself falling away. By the remarkable year of 1945, the year in which the Second World War ends, with the defeat of Nazi Germany in Europe, with the dropping of the atomic bombs upon Japan and the defeat of Japan, the United States emerges as the world's largest air force, world's biggest army in Europe, apart from the Red Soviet Army and in the Pacific. But in particular, the United States emerges as by far the #1 sea power. It has all of the characteristics which Captain Mahan had described in his book 60 years earlier on the influence of sea power upon history. It has a large sea coastal area. It has big naval shipbuilding capacities. It has high technology for naval building. It has a structure of a navy coming from the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral King, and the fellow decisive admirals in the United States Navy. And it has an enormous fleet of aircraft carriers and cruisers and destroyers and frigates and submarines. From the year 1945 onwards, therefore, the United States Navy was essentially unchallenged. There were 1 or 2 periods in the 1960s and the 1980s where the Soviet Union, the Red Navy, attempted to develop a challenge to American naval supremacy, but that tended to fall away. And with the economic collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian Navy itself also fell back into a state of decrepitude. Only in recent times, maybe you would say in the past 20 years or so, has there arisen a significant new naval challenge to American sea power across the globe. And that, as you know, is coming from the Navy of the Republic of China. Chinese naval shipbuilding is very impressive in terms of the number of destroyers and of frigates and of, first of all, diesel submarines, and then larger attack submarines. And then more recently, the development and the construction in China of their first 2 or 3 or 4 aircraft carriers, with the increasing expenditure which the government in Beijing wishes to devote to its naval forces, to its missile forces, to its submarines and frigates. It also is becoming a significant sea power, not as big as the United States Navy, but certainly very significant. There are 2 other navies which I wish to mention at this time in current affairs. One is a very, very large, though only in 3rd position, a very large Japanese Navy. Japan has been investing a great deal in large, modern destroyers and frigates, and now some of the destroyers are beginning to be helicopter destroyers, so they're like mini aircraft carriers. And of course, your own Navy, our Republic of Korea Navy, is also growing and developing modern warships as well in the area of the world that the Europeans call the Far East. That is to say, in the Western Pacific area and in East Asia. There are many other navies in the world. There are still some quite significant Western European navies like the French Navy and the Royal Navy. The Indian Navy is developing itself also quite swiftly. And under Mr. Vladimir Putin in Moscow, Russia itself is beginning to increase the size and the modern nature and firepower of its fleet and of its naval missile capabilities. So it has to be said that right now, as we come into this 2nd decade of the 21st century, sea power is regarded by governments and by their navies as one of the most important attributes of being an independent national force. The largest navy, to repeat myself, is still the United States Navy, which has fleets in different parts of the globe, in Mediterranean and to a certain extent on the east coast of the United States, and a big fleet coming out, of course, of Hawaii. The Chinese Navy can be counted in tonnage terms to be the world's 2nd largest navy. The Japanese probably now have more tonnage than the Royal Navy. And so you can think that there are about 6 or 7 or 8 quite significant navies in the world, and some younger countries like Australia, as you may have read, are wishing to develop their own navies, including their submarine navies. So as I wind down or come to the last 8 minutes or so of my remarks to you before we have some question and answer time, I would like to try to summarize what I was saying. Sea power has always been around in a smallish way, going way back thousands and thousands of years. Long-range oceanic sea power only occurred from about the year 1500 onwards and was carried out predominantly by the navies of the Western European states, Portugal, Spain, France, and especially Great Britain. Over time, Great Britain became the #1 and predominant sea power in the world, and the constituent parts of its sea power were described historically and analytically by Captain Alfred Thayer Mahn in his great book on the influence of sea power upon history. In the course of the 20th century, they steadily developed the naval power of the largest industrial and GDP country in the world, that is to say, the United States. And its victory at the end of the Second World War meant that it became, for the following 60 or 70 or 80 years after 1945, also the #1 naval power. Right now, naval power has not disappeared. Indeed, in the Western Pacific area and East Asia, naval power is once again becoming a most important part and constituent part of international politics, international affairs, and the relationship between countries. The United States, I make one final remark here, ladies and gentlemen, before I move to conclusion. The United States has, because it developed an alliance system with many of the nations of the globe, including from the Western European NATO allies, but also its alliance with Japan, with Australia, New Zealand, but most significantly for you, its alliance with the Korean nation, with the Korean Armed Services and with the Korean Navy. Naval powers in the Western Pacific are to be understood as part of alliance naval context. It is this situation, I think, we could move on now to have some interesting question and answer about sea power, past, present, and future, Korean Navy in relationship to United States Navy, United States Navy in relation to the rising naval power of China. Thank you so much for your attention, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed.